Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name is Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Eliot Rosenstock, who's a friend of The Portal, but this is his first time on the Philosophical Conversation series. He's a psychotherapist who proposes a philosophical foundation for mental health treatment based on the writings and ideas of Slavoj Žižek. He's produced or published 2 books, Žižek in the Clinic, as well as The Ego and its Hyperstate. Hopefully we'll have a chance to cover both of those books in detail today. I think for those of viewers of the channel who have not encountered your work yet, Eliot, maybe we could just start with just a personal background about you as an author, as well as maybe some of your motivations and influences in terms of getting involved in writing philosophy and specifically around the topic of psychotherapy.
Yeah, so psychology, I would say, is a degraded profession insofar as it's not as an intellectually sound profession as philosophy or anthropology, which if you want to make progress in anthropology or philosophy, you have to have very sound logic and you have to kind of make a little bit of an advancement in it. So this was my kind of inspiration for bringing philosophy into psychology, right? So my first kind of project was defining what are you doing exactly when you do mental health, which is to say defining mental health, right? And how do 2 people work together to move towards a mental health ideal, right? So this was the start of my writing because I found kind of ideology used in an oppressive way, which is to say you can imagine your boss, right? Your boss has an idea of mental health, which they embody and they kind of impose it on you. And this kind of works, right? So I wanted something more specific and to put kind of the mental health concept into a process. And then my second project was more philosophical in nature in terms of thinking through the idea of self-interest. And I became kind of interested in Max Stirner and Ayn Rand in terms of they have these ideas about self-interest that are very different. Began to think of what is self-interest in light of psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is to say your demands are actually counter your self-interest or symptomatic. So I began to kind of think this kind of idea of psychoanalytic self-interest. So my first book was thinking a more concrete definition of mental health as a process between 2 people. My second book was thinking through the idea of a ground of self-interest in the historical development after psychoanalysis, which I don't think Ayn Rand obviously doesn't represent, but is the most popular egoist theorist. And then Max Stirner didn't have the benefit of any clinical psychology wasn't really invented, I would say, by when Max Stirner was thinking of self-interest, which is to say, he did a good job of thinking the idea of the unique and kind of self as void in these kind of post-Hegelian ways. So I decided to kind of pick up this project of the self-interest concept, which is a historical project, and try to further create a further exposition of the concept of self-interest, right? Yeah, and so my current project is a much more ambitious project because those are very focused, right? My first project was what exactly is the process of mental health between 2 people, and how to say if Cadell, you came to me and said, Eliot, improve my mental health. And I'd say, don't you worry, I'm the most mentally healthy person, which is of course not the case. But nonetheless, I can have a kind of essential structure. It's how do we work together to improve your mental health, right? And how do we craft a mental health ideal? That was my initial project. And I think this isn't really investigated in terms of besides anti-psychiatry, which is to say something is wrong with people crafting a mental health ideal, and so we shouldn't, right? So this is the anti-psychiatrist kind of movement, and also Foucault and kind of critique of psychiatry and psychology. And there's lots of good reasons to do that, right? But it's not sublated or aufgebungt, right? Or whatever. It's not sublated into actually retaking up the idea of mental health as if it can't simply be discarded just because mental health practitioners are idiots, and actually trying to like define it more thoroughly. Yeah. And then my second one, like I said, is this exposition of self-interest, which is, I would say, in the lineage of egoist thought. And this third one is really thinking psychology as a subject beyond psychology, insofar as psychology has to do with life. And there's lots of different concepts or subjects that deal with life, like theology, like philosophy, or biology, or any subject that deals with the structure of life, and trying to integrate that into psychology. And what I'm writing kind of at the beginning of the hyperpsychology book is, I say hyperpsychology only to say psychology. Like, insofar as like psychology is the kind of lacking signifier, like I don't say hyperpsychology to create something beyond psychology. It's only insofar as to like better say psychology, really. Right. So that's my current project.
That's great. I mean, a first reflection on sort of what's going on here in the meta trajectory of your thought of just a rough idea is maybe that these three projects have some overlap with the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, with perhaps the first book being related to the imaginary, something like a mental health ideal.
I
The
would say the
second,
first book is the real. Like the first book
okay,
is the
okay, yeah,
real.
you tell me how you interpret it.
So the first book is like the real trauma of mental health lacking, which I would say Foucault addresses, anti-psychiatry addresses, and I address in the best way I can in my younger, I could say younger Eliot in his kind of like stupid attempt, but nonetheless, it's still important insofar as like it's the real of the kind of lack of like mental health as an ideal being like
Mhm.
thoroughly understood as a rational process, right? So this is like the real trauma. And then I would say if anything's imaginary, it would be kind of the second book insofar as it has to do with the lineage of self-interest. But it's not really imaginary. It's a specific concept, right? So concept is it's of the symbolic. Um,
Yeah, that was my first thought, was that self-interest could be thought of as a symbolic determination.
yeah. But I would say that's the closest. So I'd say real imaginary, and maybe this is more the symbolic work, which is to say like the first was like the immediate impact of like the trauma of the real, of like this industry doesn't understand it. It doesn't comprehend itself. It's not a subject that understands its own kind of ground, right?
Maybe
I,
that's a
yeah.
window in, because what I'm thinking about your work as well is that it's directly engaging the zeitgeist of our moment, which is sort of mental health. Everyone knows the symbol mental health. Of course, when we were growing
Right.
up, 80s, 70s, 60s, mental health probably wouldn't have even been a concept. It certainly wouldn't be in the zeitgeist of our moment, but now it's everywhere. It's integrated into almost all of our institutional language and bureaucracies, and in some sense more and more accepted. What's your point of view about, let's say, the ideology of mental health? Where
So
do you
so
think it
let's
goes
let's
wrong?
let's be Hegelian for a second. This is an important part of, in terms of before we say is it good or bad, it's clear that mental health as a concept has a kind of stronger position than philosophy for das Herd, right? Not us enlightened gentlemen, but like you could say das Herd. Like you say philosophy, it's like, oh, I don't kind of whatever. Mental health is like, oh yeah, I have to work on that, right? This is like, so mental health in our current like historical stage, early 21st century, that's now for all you people watching me after 100 years after I fucking am rotting, disgusting corpse in the ground, right? For all you 100 years from now. In the 21st century, mental health is a much higher elevated signifier than philosophy. It's easily grasped, right? So it's quite important to not dismiss it insofar as it's a historical reality. And no matter how many people you could say, like, say, oh, Eliot, like, I'm an anti-psychiatry. They don't say that because no one says that anymore, because it's historically we're beyond anti-psychiatry in a very literal sense. But I'm an anti-psychiatrist adjacent Deleuzian or philosopher, or I'm just like a homie, I don't care about mental health or whatever, and so on. Like, you can say this, but the fact of the matter is the force in the world means that mental health is easily gathered. Like, and maybe this is a Heideggerian existentialist concept. You can gather mental health, and then it is a kind of important quilting point or starting concept for our time, for das Zeitgeist or whatever, like our current time. You cannot get rid of mental health. So insofar as you can't get rid of the mental health concept, I try to create an exposition of mental health, which is in line with kind of this hyperstate idea or hyperpsychology, which is to say, this is kind of similar to, you could say, maybe Heraclitus, the origin of philosophy, which is what is the actual process of mental health, right? And to kind of ground people away from, I would say, the specters of ideology. And that's why Zizek in the clinic, right? In terms of, I'm trying to ground people away from the specters of ideology, that mental health, the signifier, also has tendencies of pulling people towards, right? So that's what I see this project as. And I think insofar as it works or not, we'll see. Once I'm a rotting corpse, you can look back and be like, how important was Eliot Rosenstock to history? Maybe like not so much. Maybe this was an important turning point in the integration of philosophy. Like this is, you teach Hegel, Cadell. Like I won't know. Somebody out, I spend my whole life working on this project, and then somebody, like 50 years after I'm dead will be able to look back and look at their current time and have higher knowledge than me. And I think that's quite interesting. But nonetheless, this is like my project. And so far as I'm engaging with world history, I'm trying to integrate psychology as a process with the history of philosophy. And yeah, I think there are people that want this, whether they're just like kind of basic people just discovering Hegel but don't understand them, or they've been professors for decades and are just like finding my work and being like, oh, this is interesting, and I have decades of Lacan teaching, and I speak French, and like either way, like I think there's a demand for this beyond pop psychology, right? And that's kind of what I offer. And interestingly enough, I use kind of pop venues to deliver this. So I use like social media. I use the most popular psychology platform, BetterHelp, right, in order to deliver this to people. So I would say, like, I am trying to get this idea of psychology as process out there, right?
I think it's super important in my own work. I also try to engage, let's say, the historical moment. In my doctoral thesis, it was mostly focused on the technological singularity, but it's sort of something that's a part of our moment that you can't escape, that you can't get rid of, that's ubiquitous, that's now everywhere in the discourse. And mental health, in the same way, like you're saying, is a part of our contemporary moment. At the same time, when you look back at human history objectively, life has always been tough. Life has always been difficult. I don't think people's mental health was necessarily in
Clinical psychology is a
well-attended.
new development.
All
Uh,
of this is new,
yeah,
right? So, what do you think it is about
yeah.
our historical moment that raises mental health as a signifier for our moment?
So I forget the urbanomic author in the new school, but there's lots of hip people in philosophy. If you speaking to the people who watching this after I'm a rotting corpse 100 years from now, but also you guys who may not know this, Urbanomic is a very hip philosophy publication. Lots of intelligent people with intelligent, you could say, decoding of things. I heard one decoding of clinical psychology, which is to say, so I apologize that I forget the actual theorist, but it's one of these urbanomic new school theorists. He said, psychology is a modern avant-garde revolution to use kind of very esoteric ideas and put it into medical science, right? Which I think I think this is like an interesting idea of contemporary psychology. The way I pitch it to people that are just getting introduced into psychology, I say like, I actually use this concept and I say like, you know, what we're doing here is psychotherapy. It's a modern idea. And for instance, in dream interpretation, like different cultures, different religions have used and developed concepts from dreams. I'm going to tell you a couple concepts that are from the origin of clinical psychology, which we're doing, like the ego, like condensation, and we're going to kind of use these concepts to unpack dreams, right? So I think a lot of what I do is translating these obscure philosophical concepts into like California speak. I feel like that's my like, and as a native Californian, as somebody who's like kind of engaged thoroughly with the vicissitudes of, you could say, HR ideology or California ideology, like I think this is like a core strength I have from my voc, California voc, right? But yeah, I try to take the best quality kind of analysis and translate it to green people, which is to say like new people, where whether or not you're just like, I kind of feel sad, I want some like therapy, and I try, yeah. So this, I feel like this is the, you could say, the dialectic, right, of mental health, which is we have the history of philosophy, we have all these academics, all these theories of thought, consciousness, emotions, how to understand things, and then we have, so this is the mental health subject. I don't study philosophy. I am like a business bro. I feel kind of sad. So like, so how do you reconcile the two? And that's why the mental health project, I think, is super interesting in terms of, if you think of a philosophical development, like ancient times, like you, in terms of your Hegel class that you taught, insofar as like Hegel says, ancient philosophy thought like this and modern philosophy thinks like this. You can also see this. Ancient philosophy thought you had to understand that this was important. Then you had to go to the philosophy school. You had to live like a philosopher, which is to say a Stoic or like whatever specific school. But that's no longer the case. Now you have to, I would say the real project of hyperpsychology, you could say, is to take all of it and translate it to this kind of green subject. And this is like the challenge of psychology, really. And insofar as there's lots of things you can translate to a green subject, I think it's important to make this effort to translate the history of thought and contextualizing culture and religion, versus say like, here's cognitive behavioral therapy. Here's Albert Ellis. He's kind of cool. He says, stubbornly refuse to be miserable about anything, challenge your thoughts, do opposite action, and you'll feel better. Like, there are psychology tools which are, they're here, but there's like also a kind of deeper potential to this, you could say, modern avant-garde dynamic that is psychology, right? And I've actually actualized it, which is to say, like, I teach 7 groups a week. I keep pushing them, give me more groups, like, give me more groups. So I teach 5 dream interpretation groups a week. What's a dream interpretation group? Why does that exist? Because I said it should exist. And Stoic, and then I'm surprised because people go like, I've been in dream interpretation groups before. I'm like, really? Because I feel like it took a long time for me to like create this structure, but I'm like, fair enough, this exists, great. Then the Stoic informed mindfulness and Stoic informed cognitive ideas, which is to say, how do we take Stoic ideas of locus of control, of kind of alignment, and how do we apply it? How do we think philosophically, right? So thanks to platform capitalism, I have this process where I teach green people that I'll meet for like some only an hour and a half, right? And I give them the information, then they go on their merry way and so on. So this is like the situation of, you could say, hyperpsychology. If you can imagine the green subject who's like trying to, feel a bit better, and then I'm trying to translate the entire history of like consciousness, which is quite deep, in a way that works for them. So this is like the dialectical challenge, you could say, right?
I was going to say that your situation kind of reminds me, I don't know if the association fails or not, but it kind of reminds me as Freud and Jung coming over the ocean, and the classic line of, we're bringing them the plague, or They don't know we're bringing them the plague. In this case, it's the digital ocean, and the people
21st
you're.
century is more positive. Like I'm bringing them. They should be grateful, like that I
Yeah,
exist.
so that's, I mean, there's a few dimensions here that I want to highlight and get your opinion on, because of all of the various theoretical characters in our digital space, our intellectual milieu, I feel like you're the one who's engaging the most practically with forms of psychotherapy and forms of philosophy, like you just said, the Stoic mindfulness meditations, or the, group psychotherapy sessions, where a lot of people, especially in the Frodo-Lacanian spaces, wouldn't give those spaces any time or wouldn't give those spaces any attention. And also a lot
Yeah,
of
but who
people
the
argue,
fuck is like Freud? Who like you talk to a random person who signs up for say like BetterHelp? Oh, the Freudian Lacanian space doesn't. They don't. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody. Nobody gives a shit. And there's a reason nobody gives a shit because you're trying to feel better, and you're in the vicissitudes of our current culture, and the Freudio-Lacanian space is closed. It's a bubble, right? That's the truth of it. So you have to think of hyperpsychology. The subtitle is A Subject Beyond Itself. You cannot simply be internal to Freudio-Lacanian space. You have to be able to go into general culture, right?
no,
And
totally agree. And I think
yeah,
this is, I was trying to frame this as one of the strengths and one of the things I appreciate about you, and one of the things that I always appreciate when I see you interacting in our digital spaces, is that you are often disrupting these closed loops, and you're
right.
pointing out these sort of ideologies, and you are functioning, from my observations, as someone who is internally disruptive to these ideologies in a very practical and important way, in the sense that it's almost like the people in these spaces, when they do become too hermeneutically sealed, fall into a performative contradiction, or fall into a
Yeah.
performative paradox with the people who they're inspired by and the people who they're basically implicitly idolizing.
Yeah, you
But
can become hermeneutically sealed, hermetically sealed, right? Hermeneutically sealed. It's like a fun, won't think about that too long. A proper Lacanian duality, right? Hermetically sealed, I think is the phrase. Hermeneutically, which is by what you said, by the narrative you're sealed, right?
well, I think
Um,
it's also what connects us maybe a little bit, because even though I do teach in that certain lineage, I also try to expose myself to thinkers, philosophers, practitioners who are not necessarily following that line directly, although, of course, engaging with people who do follow that line, but
yeah,
trying to
I was
create a more
saying, yeah,
diverse thought space.
one thing I want to say is you teach people like me, so, right? So you inform people like me, which is not easy because, like, as you can see, I have quite a deep line of philosophy. I have my own, books, but you inform me. So that's its own role. Like, this is a very hard role. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't want to dismiss the role of teaching extremely educated people specifically. Like, that's quite difficult. I don't do that, right? Like, I think maybe cursorily I try to like maybe, but I certainly don't focus on teaching very educated people like more things. Like I think a lot of teaching like almost like frontier psychiatry, right? Which is teaching the green people like the
Maybe
history.
let's define the green people. What do you mean by green people? I think I mean, I would get the stereotype of of course, the Californian hippie, people who are really focused on ecological and
Green, sorry,
environmental
by green I mean
concerns.
new. I mean like when you say oh this person like in a soldier like a soldier who's in his first deployment, they say oh he's green. They say he's new, right?
People
Um,
who are just entering this world, people
yeah,
who are just
just
discovering,
entering this world.
becoming.
Exactly.
I think that the example of the business bro who says, I feel a little bit sad, is a probably an archetypal great example here.
It's a it's a real example. I mean, I
Yeah.
I see people like that all the time in
Yeah.
therapy, right? And I have to help. Like I have to help, and they have to reflect and go, that helped. That's the goal. So like in Zizek in the clinic, this is what I'm kind of like trying to map out, which is this process of like doing some. whatever your ideology as the therapist or their ideology, it's hard to create a universal structure that works with every ideology, right? So if you think about this, like I have to work with any ideology that exists on the planet, like any other person, right? So this is also what's different than like politics, which is to say, oh, these people are thinking wrong. I can't simply say that. Like I have to engage in a process with them that creates a self-confirming progression of mental health, right? Which is not easy. It's not always possible, especially if someone's hermeneutically sealed, right? Which I like this new phrase, which is to say like, I have a narrative. I'm not going to let you change it. And in fact, I'm going to harden this narrative, like in this kind of thing. Like people, you have the ability to do that. But the question is like, are you willing to, kind of do have to submit, you could say, to the master signifier that mental health exists. You have a mental health, which is a concept, and that it progresses, like in process, right? Not everybody's willing to do this, in fact. So that's what the first book is about. That's why it's the real. Like it's the traumatic real of kind of like dealing with the vicissitudes of life, trying to kind of create this concept with people, and the challenge of kind of creating this movement of progression through this concept.
So that
Right?
there's a part of Zizek in the clinic where you talk about mental health and progress, but you also try to disassociate it in my reading from the concept of happiness, and you're more pointing in the direction of, it seemed to me, like movement of the psyche from one place to another. Very practically, how do we get to, say, a better place?
Yeah. So this
What
is
is
in
a
our,
better place? What does progress mean?
yeah,
What does the master signifier mental health mean, and what does progress mean? And when we talk
yeah.
about movement from like one space to another space, how does that work for you, and why is it more complex than happiness?
Right. So I'll start with, there's a contradiction between like Zizek and Peterson agree, but the general Geist doesn't. So you should consider the fact that Zizek and Peterson agree with each other, but society doesn't agree with either of them, which is to say happiness is not a good signifier, right? When they debate, they like both of them say like, yeah, it's not a good signifier. You need to embrace chaos or fight the chaos. I'm working on it. My Peterson. Anyway, and Zizek's like, of course, the light at the end of the tunnel is another train, and it's going to hit you, and you're going to die. Fuck you, like
Yeah.
and so on. Right. So
We've
this
got
is
like a
so
hard road that ends in a doom.
yeah. But the general guise is I want to be happy, right? I want to feel joy. I want to feel good. So we already kind of have this problem between like philosophers and theory with this like happiness signifier. So what I wrote in Zizek in the clinic in terms of ultimately you come to therapy for a change, like in the most, so starting like more vague notion, it's like you come to therapy for a change. This actually isn't always true. Some people say I'm coming to therapy because I want to go to therapy and I'm not here to change. I'm here to kind of see you. Like I want to see you. I want to kind of see you like do your thing or whatever, but I'm not going to change. Like you can have, so like this is the thing about concepts. You can do that if you want. But in general, you come to therapy for a change, right? And then you have to figure out this idea of mental health, which is not happiness, which mental health is dealing with the vicissitudes of all emotions, anger, anxiety, happiness, every possible human fluctuation. And you have to contextualize it in the concept of mental health. And you have to have an idea that as you progress and deal with all these vicissitudes, that you're doing something that you can call mental health or mentally healthy or improving, right?
And what is improvement there? Like, I love the concept of vicissitudes, and I love the idea that mental health is some sort of flexibility in relationship to all emotions. Is improvement being better and better at being able to navigate those vicissitudes in some way?
Yeah, so for instance, a SMART goal. So this is psychology. Let's talk psychology. Standard of practice. You need a SMART goal, specific, measured goal. I feel anxious at a level 7 out of 10, 4 times a week. Eventually, I'll feel like 4 out of 10 anxiety twice a week. And I've successfully progressed. That's a SMART goal, right? That's not, I don't think that's the best model to understand life. which is to say, like, throughout the day, I have various emotions, I have various conflicts, I have my life, which I've chosen, right? And I navigate the vicissitudes of my emotion. And ultimately, I I kind of conceptualize mental health outside of any of particular symptoms. So psychology right now is very like specifically highlight the symptom, reduce the symptom. But like I say, like ultimately the subject beyond itself has to go into life itself, right? So I think there's a lot of things that are foreclosed from psychology because it doesn't fit this medicalization of life, right? So you can think of psychology as essentially a medicalization of life. Why should life be purely medicalized? And you can see in COVID, and don't get me wrong, I was like first in line for the vaccine. You know, I was the first one. I got chewed out for wearing a mask before anybody. But there's a question of like how much of life should be medicalized, right? And there's a tendency to not question the medicalization of life or not to see life as containing all these other possibilities beyond the medical concept. And psychology is not really good at thinking that. They have, they have ideas of what is health, and you kind of like conform to these ideas. So anyway, that's kind of this current project, and that's why like my current project is a more challenging project insofar as like there was something really wrong with mental health, and the first one is like, well, the entire concept of mental health is bad. Clearly, we should think mental health as a concept and a process, and I can just expound on that. Or self-interest is not really thought correctly in history because it's Max Stirner, the void subject, pure void subject, and kind of bodily self-interest, and Ayn Rand, the capitalist self-interest. So there's a lot of room for improvement. So both of my past projects there's like a flaw in history. And this one I'm really trying to kind of push forward psychology into a new era. And that's kind of a more ambitious project. And the biggest kind of obstacle I would say is the reality of clinical psychology, which is to say the monetary kind of structure is like, it's going to follow these SMART goals that I told you of, like reduce. It's going to like use these kind of concepts. It doesn't have a lot of incentive to bring in the history of philosophy, but nonetheless, like me doing this ritual of kind of saying there's a lack in psychology itself. Like we'll see. Like I said, in 100 years, after 50 years after I'm dead, like they'll know better, like how this
I like
influenced it, right?
I like your perspective on challenging the over medicalization of life, as
Yeah,
well as the deep investigation of and I would say the mystery of day-to-day mood. Because
yeah.
even if I'm not like struggling with a symptom, like there's nothing specific that I can identify, like a knot in my psyche, which is driving me insane or driving me into madness. If I just am paying attention to the day-to-day fluctuations of my mood, even the hour to hour, the moment to moment fluctuations of my mood, sometimes you can get like sometimes you're not really clinically depressed, or you wouldn't say you have a symptom, but just not feeling the best.
Hmm.
Just just, just not feeling the best
But
right now.
out of 10, how
Yeah.
bad would you say you feel? And then how many times a week? And then let's improve that. No,
Yeah.
but this is the problem with the modern psychology model. Like, that's not like it essentializes in a very particular way. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good focus. It's a good place to be. I can also see why it would be difficult to incentivize that. I can also see why it would be difficult to build a capitalist paradigm around that. But I feel pretty good with that as a general discourse in terms of just focusing on the moment to moment fluctuations of mood, and again, I think the mystery of mood. But all of this is a great starting point to jump into, perhaps specifically here Zizek in the clinic to start. My first encounter with Zizek in the clinic was actually when we didn't know each other, and we were invited onto a podcast
Right.
by someone else, and I read Zizek in the clinic, and reflecting on Zizek in the clinic now a few years later, my first thought is, well, it's really interesting experiment to bring Zizek to the clinic, because the reason why it's interesting to me is because it's kind of the opposite of the way I tend to think, which is that Zizek brings psychoanalysis to philosophy,
Right.
but you're bringing Zizek to psychotherapy,
Right.
is not psychoanalysis, and you make a distinction there. I can see why that's useful in terms of Zizek's ideology and his focus on ideology. But in Zizek's own sort of personal relationship to psychoanalysis, he undermined
He
his own
doesn't, well, he
analysis.
doesn't do it, does
He
he?
didn't do it. He undermined it.
Yeah.
And so self-sabotaged his own analysis, you could say. I guess my first question would be, what do you think are the stakes of not
Well,
only
well, this is the
taking
first
Zizek's.
form. Like I said, this is the first kind of strike of lack in psychology, right? Anti-psychiatry. I simply don't participate, right?
Mhm.
And Zizek's of that with himself. But I mean, insofar as, he said lots of degrading things about the psychotherapy form, and that's because he's focused on, you could say, like, world events, global warming, war, and ergo, if you talk to somebody, this is like bourgeois, and so I don't think about it. Um, so he basically dismisses the interpersonal, and I think if it was up to Zizek, we would talk at this kind of, you could say, world level, right? Everything would be world level. So it's kind of let's go. So it's like, could you take that into mental health and say to people like, you're thinking about your personal life, but really you should think world level or whatever,
Yeah,
right?
I just had a
Uh,
conversation with Terrence Blake on the channel, and his criticism, inspired by the science of logic in regards to the Slovenian school, was that they do being and concept, but they don't do essence. And we would interpret this as dismissing the interpersonal level, perhaps.
yeah, but also just letting go of actual forces in the world or just kind of dismissing them. It is a specific kind of ethics, like what is allowed to appear is global politics only, right? But so Zizek has, Zizek kind of introduced, I would say, the millennial generation to the critique of ideology, right? In terms of like what is ideology? How does ideology function? How do you think you're free from control, but actually you are controlled in a specific way? How do you think you represent the infinite, but you represent something specific? How do you think you're, free, but you think you're a zero, but you're a one. You think you're at infinity, but you're a one. Like you're doing something very specific, right? So this is, I think, very important for mental health, because I think mental health will take up the specter of infinity and nothing and all this kind of thing, and to the detriment of the people trying to get help from it, right? So I think Zizek's philosophical, Zizek is kind of like I would say he's a, world spirit on horseback kind of philosopher. Like he really, no, really, in terms of for this moment, he's pulled the world
I can
to
totally agree.
Hegel and Lacan, and the fact that he thinks psychoanalysis, but psychology itself doesn't think Zizek or doesn't think the critique of ideology is like a big problem. I think insofar as Zizek isn't simply a sophist, like Zizek is not like pitching critique of ideology as a way to empower himself and blah blah blah. Like this is dialectic. So dialectic is like it's the exposition of rationality in the world, right? So Zizek kind of points out that you take up lots of things kind of without thinking, and you think you're doing kind of one thing, but you're really doing the next thing. So I think like it clearly benefits therapists, and I would say like what happens when I teach people things kind of in line with this, it's like I noticed this about rationality. It's like when you point it out to people, they think they always thought it because it's the best, most rational idea. So I see this even in people that like who disagree with me, and like they take up certain things and they'll be like, well, of course I think this because it's right. It's like, well, you wouldn't have thought it if I didn't expose you to this like concept, right? But people, they take up more rational and better quality things quite easily. And I think this is like, to go back to like why this is Hegelian more than Lacanian, it's like this is an increase in quality of like mental health and this sort of thing, right? So yeah.
I think it was super important point when you said that mental health in some ways is doomed to pick up the specter of metaphysical concepts like infinity or nothingness, the void. I think that we've approached mental health in many ways without metaphysics. We've approached mental health without realizing that we cannot get out of metaphysics. And as a consequence of that, we've dumbed down the field and perhaps reduced the field to either an organistic paradigm or a mechanistic paradigm where the metaphysics of infinity and the metaphysics of nothing and the metaphysics of life and death are probably something that you encounter in your day-to-day practice on a daily basis. How do you think metaphysics and ideology are functioning in what you see in the practice, and how has engaging ŽIŽEK'S work helped you as a practitioner?
Um, I think there's a tendency to see these partial wholes as like the highest, which is to say like psychology is the highest state of being, or like philosophy for that matter, or politics. Um, so I would say metaphysics, insofar as life is the highest state of being, which can be achieved. I think Nietzsche also, I think people have worked on like what is kind of the highest category, right? Uh, in the ancient world is philosophy itself or rationality. But I don't think, you know, in our modern era, we're not trying to necessarily create philosophers. What we're trying to do is make this kind of psychological structure more rational for general life. So not everybody in the world has to learn like psychology, right? So I think part of part of the larger whole is to start to think, to be grounded in kind of the telos of life, right? Life itself, you could say, whether it's philosophical or not, and to use philosophy in a way as kind of like a meta ethics for people's lives, and uh, psychology's job is to address a pluralistic set of values and to generate mental health in a pluralistic set of values, in each set of values, which without kind of saying you have to end it, this particular idea which will save the world. And I think this is obviously ŽIŽEK'S project, which is like the world's doomed, like know that the world is doomed in a very specific way, versus like psychology's project is not that. And I would say psychology's project is actually worth thinking about, insofar as maybe we're not as doomed as you think, right? Insofar as like psychology actually needs to be thought in this kind of pluralistic way. So what if there's a singular ethics or understanding of what psychology is that can address an infinite set of values, right? And that's why psychology is like a very kind of specific challenge. I think that's not really the same challenge as philosophy or religion. It's like this kind of relation. So yeah, I think this is like, you could say this is metaphysics, but I would say it's like dialectics, right? It's dialectics, really. So
So my interpretation of ŽIŽEK in the clinic when I was reading it was in regards to this specific psychological project and your engagement with specifically bringing ŽIŽEK into it is the concept of what you call the vanishing point, or what I call the vanishing mediator, what I hear called the vanishing mediator a lot. Is vanishing point, is vanishing mediator the same thing?
I would
And
say
how does
vanishing meteor is a more complicated concept.
so
Like,
explain how you're bringing vanishing point, vanishing mediator into this conversation, and I guess in the
yeah.
context of singularity of ethics
So a
and
therapist is the
yeah.
vanishing mediator in my ethics, you could say. In ŽIŽEK in the clinic, it's outlined in a math theme, which I won't get into because I thought I was really clever writing the
Yeah.
math.
Was that with the one and the zero?
One in the but I mean the whole point is
Like the set?
like therapist as a vanishing mediator, I think is a nice summary. That's
Yeah.
fine. That's fine. Um, but a vanishing point is different because this is a more ancient idea, which is telos, right? Which is like what is the end? Like what is the purpose of your action. And so like critique of like how do you critique ideology in a way that produces mental health is the telos, right? Insofar as ideology or the vicissitudes of contradiction produce negative mental health, you have this simultaneous job of defining mental health and kind of working with somebody and creating an experience. And the problem is there's no, I think Lacan would say there's no guarantee of the analysis, right? There's no kind of guarantee. Is you're working with kind of these circling vicissitudes of emotion, of dominant social ideology, and you're trying to produce an ends. And you could be really obstinate in this production of ends. Like hypothetically, you could say, I will not produce an ends. And this is like, you do have to kind of, I think one thing to point out is psychology has a limit insofar as you're working with other people, right? Let's go into the history of philosophy for a second. Like Stoicism knew this very well, and then we kind of forget this. Like, which is to say, sometimes there's a limit. And in psychoanalysis, we say, oh, life happens after castration, which is like, yeah, but do you really know what a limit is? Kant says there's limits that produce knowledge. It's like, but do you really know what a limit is? Like, I would say the idea of the limit is kind of lost in terms of like a working knowledge. But I would say Stoicism, for instance, has the idea of the limit in terms of the limit is the other. So like this is quite important for therapists, which is to say like you can do this process, but ultimately it's a process for an other, which is like a teaching, which ultimately means you cannot simply control the other person or make them wise or like do this thing. So you're limited by the other. And you could say, to broaden this beyond the therapist client, you could say anything you're treating external to you, right? It is limited by like you have your amount of force and you're in a constant dialectical relation to the thing you're trying to create. And yeah, so yeah, sorry, Cadell. I wanted to kind of get this.
So there's I mean, I think that was a good job of articulating, or I think the core of what you're articulating there is that there is a history in philosophy from Stoicism to Kant and up to psychoanalysis with the recognition of the importance of limit.
Yeah.
We could symbolize that with the critique of pure reason introduces a limit. We could say, for example, castration introduces the idea of a limit. But you're saying that we don't have a really practical, workable understanding of limit, and
We don't.
interpret that in popular culture, in the popular zeitgeist, people massively struggle psychologically with limit.
Yeah, and maybe we can even go to ego in the hyperstate now. We're like 50 minutes into this. So like what is the limit? And this is the next book. Right? So next book is all about kind of actual force in the world and thinking in terms of force, right? Which is to say like what is the force which is indeterminate and rationally known of my ability to kind of work with this person or this institution, or what are kind of the actual forces that push things or move things, or what force do things contain? And so this is like why this is, I would say, the first is about the real of like the lack, and then this second one you could say is like symbolic, but also has this imaginary quality maybe when you start to think of things in terms of the force they carry, right? This is it's a very essentialist text, and kind of at the beginning I say this is about basically describing the psychoanalytic concept of the ego and kind of bringing it into egalitarian relationship with the force of all things, which is to say like I'm taking my idea of myself, seeing how my idea of myself turns into causes or things I want to happen in the world or in my life, and then having this kind of indeterminate force like rational unpacking. And like this is, I think this is like, people don't get this, like like I, as the Joker would say, you wouldn't get it, but nobody gets it. Or as Hegel said, no one understands me. But I mean, it's actually quite a solid idea. So I hope people eventually get this, like, ego. My idea of the ego is the exact math of force, right? So I would say like this is also, I would say, like philosophy, psychology, aesthetics, everything in the world is maybe becoming harder, more actual in this century. And so I would say one kind of tendency of this hyperpsychology project that's in ego in its hyperstate is not looking at ego as a specter of the imaginary or like an imaginary thing, but rather looking at its ability to identify with certain forces in the world. Right. And also to say like the limit, so where limit comes in is like what is my actual influence on this force in the world? How much am I like a baby pretending to drive, right? Like while things are happening outside of me and so on. So it really is like a kind of effort into changing the fundamental like idea of ego and make it more actual, make it more concrete. So this is like a very philosophical kind of project, this second book.
All right,
Yeah.
so it's a good place to start because let me sort of say in the way in which it challenges my own ideology or the way I usually teach my own understanding of the ego. There's some passage in the Decree that I always quote where Lacan has this pithy line about how the ego is nothing but imaginary
Just
frustration.
just an ego. The ego is
Yeah,
just the ego.
right. So and it is sort of connected always to the imaginary. It's connected to the mirror stage. It's connected with traversing the fantasy and all of these other common sort of
So
terms
here's
in
why that's
thinking.
correct. Let me start by
Mhm,
saying why is that correct? Say I
mhm.
really want Kamala to be elected. Right, like
Kamala
my
2020 2024. Kamala.
Kamala
Yeah, I'm pumped.
Blindian as a white Ashkenazi, I respect the Blindian. Like as Nick Land said to me, ethnic complexity. That's what he said. Where's the ethnic complexity? I'm white and Ashkenazi. She's black and Indian. Why are people challenging this? You know, Trumpers don't let her be black and Indian. So I'm against the Trumpers, and I'm pro Kamala, right? So say I'm
Kamala 2024.
Kamala, hypernormality, boss maxing. Let's go. I wrote about it. You can read it soon. Anyway, um, um, so why is Lacan right about my ego there? Which is like this has forces in the world. The actual kind of quantitative force that's going to influence Kamala getting elected or not. Right? There's kind of a specific method of like political actualizing. You know, white guys for Kamala, black women for Kamala, white women for Kamala, like everyone's for Kamala. Like this is the force. That's force, right? Me going on your podcast saying Kamala 20, like it's just less force, right? It's indeterminate, like how much less force, but rationally I can say it's totally insignificant. It's like zero, and all these black women for Kamala, white women, white men, all this is like it's something, and my force for Kamala is zero, zero, right? So this is like thinking the limit in force, right? You could say hyper, but we're not done yet. So I have zero. This is my project, which I've told you before, of my research project that angers people, which is why do you vote if your vote doesn't count? And I've continually made a more nuanced answer as I like, you know, I've been thinking this problem for over a decade. So like I'm a crazy person. If you're watching this and I'm dead and it's 150 years from now, I want it to be known that I'm a crazy person. So I'm a crazy person. That's why I've thought this question, why do you vote if your vote doesn't count? Like I've thought this for over a decade. And I'll tell you, over a decade of thinking this question, like you're gonna get the fruit of this. You didn't have to think this, but you're gonna get the answer. Like you're standing on shoulders of giants. Like anyway, like fuck you. Anyway, you didn't have to think about it. I put all the labor in and you just get the fucking knowledge. Like fuck you. Anyway. Right. So
You might get the recognition, though. You might get the recognition.
probably like who gives a shit? Like who am I? Anyway, like no, you're just gonna get the knowledge, and then everyone forgets where the knowledge came from, and that's the absolute whatever. Anyway, but you're gonna get the knowledge. So we're now kind of in the question of like what is the significance of my ritual, of my like Kamala ritual, right? So now we're back in the realm of personal psychology. And this is why psychology is important. Because if you think politics, you might be tempted to say, Elliot, your Kamala 2024 doesn't influence whether she gets elected or not, which is true. But how do you understand like 100 million people in the same boat? Like speaking of the multiplicities of the ones, right? So this is, Cadell, what you understand from your science of logic analysis, right? Which is there's a multiplicity of ones. So there's 100 million people with zero impact. But that's kind of a lot of people, right? So are they really doing nothing when they ritualize towards Kamala or towards Trump? I would basically argue now at this point that despite me having zero political impact by being Kamala 2024, which I am, of course, unironically, like go Kamala. She spoke with the National Union of Health Workers. What more do I want? I was at the union meeting. There was Kamala on Zoom, of course, but she was there. I know her basically, right? I was in the audience, right? So ultimately, I'm doing a ritual. If I decide that this is important, I do not know the force of me doing rituals for Kamala. Like I'm going to be part of the K Hive. Like like I am K Hive. We are against Trump. And then people will be like, you shouldn't really care about politics. You should. And I go, no, Trump is evil. Fuck you. Trump is evil. Trump is evil. Like I could do this ritual. It will have inter resonance. It's like, oh, Elliot's kind of a dick. He keeps fucking saying Trump is evil and Kamala 2024. He won't stop asking me to get him a grande latte. Like, what's wrong with him? I'd be like, fuck you. I don't care. And this is like, I can have single-mindedness of cause. I can create a ritual and it will have like unknown effects in my personal life, and it will create kind of it will have actual effects. So like, why do you vote if your vote doesn't count? Which is to say, why do I say something that I'm doing something for a category which I have no effect in, but ultimately it has a kind of unknown resonance in the interpersonal? And it's because things will shape towards my ego, right? So ultimately, like my ego is the same thing as self-interest. It's the same thing as my identity. It goes into actual causes in the world in terms of I like Kamala, I become the Kamala Geist and so on. And so like so this is kind of like this is like the challenge of ego. And I think the second philosophy book is like really a philosophical work, really trying to like comprehend. If I go beyond kind of traditional definitions of ego and I start to understand it as force in the world and the possibility of kind of aligning an identity and kind of this process of taking up the world as self, ego in its hyper self or hyperstate, right? Hyper self, right? Like what happens? So yeah, that's the second project.
So the question here that comes to my mind, just to make sure that we're approaching some sort of theoretical territory that I can grasp,
Right.
is in Lacan, there's the distinction between ego and the subject of the unconscious.
Right.
And this distinction is on display throughout the entirety of the Acree. How should I be understanding ego and the subject of the unconscious in relationship to
Yeah,
ego
why?
and its hyperstate?
I would say like you should understand my version as a collapse of definition, clearly. In terms of psyche as ego, as all the works of my body is my ego. So it's a kind of collapsing Spinozan monism. You should understand it as that. And why collapse it? Because it will show you something maybe different than what Lacan will show you with his diremptions of ego and ego as specter, right? Or ego as lacking or whatever. So I'm trying to show you ego as force, like in
Okay.
ego as a more concrete actual. I would say I'm trying to adjust ego as exact math, right? Ego is not simply like a specter. Like ego is
Okay.
actually a force, and I think this is why it's the tradition of egoism, right? Because I'm saying ego is a force versus ego is a specter, right?
Okay. And is that how you get to the idea of self-interest as a foundation for the world or for psychology, or because you state explicitly
Self-interest
so
is the foundation of life. all your, so this is the idea. So this is like this, it's an axiomatic argument, right? So I'm not saying like you could make another like structure about what life is, right? This is like a particular hermeneutic. Every action you do is self-interest, but why do you do it? Right? So this is like, in there is the question of the unconscious and the psyche, right? And it's kind of giving precedence to your creation. So like the very start of the book is like your dream is a good example, because here in your dream you're repressing things and expressing things. You're articulating symptoms. It's, you could argue that you're not doing the most efficient thing, but nonetheless, you're, every moment you're doing the best. You're doing the best you can every moment, right? So it's ultimately a theory of psychological egoism. So who's talking about psychological egoism? I don't think anybody but me, right? So, psychological egoism is this basic concept you can't escape: self-interest. And then afterwards they say, so what? And they go, yeah, so what? Fuck it. But what I'm saying is psychological egoism. You can't escape self-interest. And then I'm going kind of much, much, much further, I would say, than the theories of psychological egoism go, which is to say, to really kind of like expound on like the implications of this. Like if you call every action that anybody does your self-interest because it's mediated, even though it's repressing and expressing certain things and making certain actions and articulating certain things self-interest, then where does that lead you? And that's the ego in its hyperstate. And I tell you where it leads you, right? Over 100 and so pages.
Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. So I guess the first point of contact I have with that idea is that my introduction to Zizek's philosophy and Hegel's philosophy does kind of approach metaphysics under the idea that you can't ever escape self-reference. That self-reference is
Yeah.
like basically it's like a critique of pre-modern ontologies where you think, of course, pre-Kantian ontologies to be specific, like where you think you can get to the outside, to the great outdoors, to some understanding of reality independent of my own self-reference. And Kant and the German idealist tradition is where this stops, where self-reference is always a part of it. You can't escape it. You've got to work with it. The process of your own self-narration and things like that. Really, do you see this as why your project leans more to the Hegelian Zizek'ian end of things than, let's say, introducing the idea of the subject of the unconscious, or like you said, collapsing the idea of the subject of the unconscious?
Yeah, I would say it's very much in this kind of line of the inability to escape self-reference, right? But I would say it's like we both say it. I don't say it because I like fetishize Kant. Like it's because it's the truth, right? Because it's a more solid foundation of life, of like understanding your speech, right? So I think like it's not to like perpetuate German idealism. It's to perpetuate kind of like the actual ground of like speech and life and existence and things like that, right? And if you know that, if you
That's
know,
important to say. That's
yeah,
important to say.
yeah, and if you know this is the case, right? If you know that it is an exposition of self-reference, then you just follow what is the self-reference, and you don't simply say like your self-reference is, you qualitatively judge if good or bad or whatever, but to try to follow it a bit.
So I've struggled a lot with like because when I first encountered this line of thinking, it seemed to me intuitively true. And then following it through to its conclusions, I see that it's also, I think, concretely true, say rationally true. But I do encounter a lot of people that do try to escape self-reference and do want to build a model or have some sort of ontology or have some sort of relationship to
Do you
a
want to know
community
who escapes
or a group.
self-reference? Every
Mhm.
single person going to therapy. Like nobody needs to know that. Right? So like I don't say like you're cured once you understand the ground of consciousness is self-reference or self-interest. Like that's not, but it's like ultimately you have to realize like a philosopher, like if you kind of if you want to pursue philosophy or psychology, the ground of speech and understanding, and I categorically kind of go on in terms of how you get partial self-references. So like causes, ideas, wholes, connections, exiting, entering, all this kind of stuff. But then the ultimate ground is like the dream intuit. I would say like the dream intuition, which is your psyche understands and produces things faster than you can intentionally grasp it, right? So this is kind of like the core self-reference force, right? And part of it is like coming to relation, like for me, like coming to a relation with this. But I would even say ego, like my definition of ego is such an expanded concept that I would say this entire thing is ego. So this is why it's not really like the Freudian definition of ego,
Right. So like you're
right?
not so you're engaging with psychoanalysis, but really it seems like most of the time in your work you're encountering or you're engaging with psychoanalysis in an antagonistic way. So whether it's collapsing the distinction between ego and the subject of the unconscious, or if we're using the Freudian model of the ego, the id, and the superego, how does this function in your idea of ego and its hyperstate?
Yeah, I mean, I have ideas of the super ego and the id that are more Freudian, I would say. Like super ego is like the ideal. So like how it's super I don't talk much about the super I talk about the super ego in the book as a unity, which is to say like when you unify, there's an imperative for me to not like click off Zoom, for instance. Like goodbye, Cadell. Does that make you nervous? No, but like no, but really like this is a basic kind of core of like super ego is a unity. I get an oceanic. So this is like the tendency of the dream is to repress. It expresses things, uh, and it represses things. So like super ego is like here's something that will help me. So once I like put investment into that, I'm also simultaneously pressured to not disinvest, right? So that's super ego. Um, but also like super ego in dream analysis is like ideals, which are also another double-edged sword. So super ego is like I want to be the best. So mental health as an ideal, right? I'm going to create mental health. I must do this the best I can. That's super ego. But also it has certain negative pressures, which is to say like will you understand a limit when you hit it? I would say that's the big one. Like for mental health practitioners, do you really understand what the limit of being one person talking to the next is? And like stoicism's really good at that limit. Um, right. So that's super ego, you could say. And then id is like I would say I think id less the silent drive because I think I collapse id into ego a lot, which is like id, the silent drive and so on. I probably think it less.
Which
Yeah,
is which
to
is
be
I think
honest.
what you were trying to get at with the ego and the subject of the unconscious being collapsed, because usually I would associate the subject of the unconscious with the silent drive,
Right.
or if not the silent drive, some sort of movement, some sort of I always call it like an immortal movement, like it's not going to stop. It's the eper si muove. It's the
Yeah,
and yet
so I
it's
would say if we were to like rationally think of like where does id fall into I would say it is silent. It is the thing that produces the psyche. Like what is producing it? I don't think I answered I don't I say there's something producing it, which is the totality of forces. Like you could say. Right? Um it's the you could say that it is probably the cause of production broadly.
so maybe now that we have a deeper grounding of the way you're relating to these ideas,
Yeah.
Could we go a little bit deeper into what you mean by hyperstate? Because I don't think I've really grasped that notion yet.
The ego is its hyperstate. It is the process. So to say like ego
So
is
is the hyperstate the ego as process?
so to get a bit more like concrete, like I said, Kamala, like the ego is the force and its lack and its kind of and its ratio, right? There's a Hegelian category. It's a ratio of like zeroness to like the actual cause. It's the ego is also the actual interpersonal effects that it has. So this is this expanded version of the ego, which I would call that hyperstate, which I don't say hyperstate a lot because it's like the hyperstate is like the interpersonal effects, the psychological effects. It's the totality of things, right? Like it's the decoded hyperstate is the word for the demythologized uncoding of all things, right? So absolute hyperstate is like the total works of humanity decoded, which you can't ever grasp a whole like that, but you can like aim to partial wholes like causes and different things. So that's like absolute hyperstate is like the totality of effects and causes. Um, but then ego is kind of like the actual force of the single individual, you could say, in the world and the speech and through these categories. It's trying to get a concrete understanding of like the impact of a person, right? So it's kind of like a newish word which is less important than like the concept, I think. The hype is hyperstate. Like hyperstate's the word for the decoded thing. Like if the mythological version of the thing is a subcategory. So like if I was to say like if I was
Is
to
mythology the coded?
mythology is like the concept um obscuring forces, right? So it's
Yeah,
like
I'm on the same page with you there. Because I
yeah,
often think about the relationship between myth and drive, what you're calling force, but then,
yeah.
yeah, oftentimes myth can obscure drive.
Yeah, and maybe it's the thing about this is maybe it's turtles all the way down, which is like everything. So I'm working on this concept of myth, critique, and hyper, which is to say you get the mythic obscured concept, you get the kind of critique or the kind of unveiling, and then you get the hyper, which is the actual force kind of before the myth and kind of the myth having its own force and effects. But it's once you kind of this is what I've been talking with Kirsty a lot about actually, which is to say like Kirsty's been investigating kind of like archetypes, which I'm like prone to dismiss quite quickly, Jungian archetypes, but like only insofar as like I think concept is better, but ultimately kind of like the product of our conversations is something like uh, that there is this kind of myth in between obscuring forces or archetype or whatever, and it has its own force, which you could broadly call this like ideology. And there's a question of once you look at these forces, like is this its own myth in some way? And I would say of course it is, because it's like always a partial, like it's not like the totality of things. So you could always kind of follow forces and myth kind of in this way and decoding in this way. So you ultimately get to like, I think it like this theory accounts for this kind of post-structural notion of signs referencing signs, but I feel like it takes it to the next level where it's not kind of ending in, like Peterson's like, signs reference signs, so nothing means anything. Nothing means anything. It's all postmodern. They say,
That it
anybody
erodes
can.
meaning.
Yeah, no. So like no, there is meaning and self-interest there. And I like to hold the place that self-interest can be very basic.
Like
Like it
meaning
doesn't.
is stabilized through self-reference, that self-reference doesn't undermine meaning just because there's no meaning behind the self-reference.
Yeah, the being of self-interest, the being of
Yeah, yeah.
myself
Yeah. I think that's the
grounds.
big shift. Like
Yeah.
in the pre-modern or the ancient world, there's always this searching for a meaning behind this play of self-reference or this signs referencing signs. and you'll get this in people like looking in the past for some deep meaning in an ancient text or something like that.
Yeah.
But just this signs referencing signs, it just means that to me, it just means we have a higher responsibility to the process of meaning making.
So this is I would call that a cause. We have a higher responsibility to the process of meaning making. Why? Why should I invest in that cause? Why do we have a higher responsibility to the process of meaning making? Do you think, Kiddo? Or maybe I already do. Maybe I'm being like a sophist, but like
Well,
why?
I think that we have a high like you can you can avoid that responsibility, but if you avoid that responsibility, you'll either become dependent on an external system of meaning making,
Right.
or you could fall into a type of directionless or meaningless pit.
Yeah. I think you and Kirsty are both kind of like grounding me in the same direction because I'm happy to kind of like dislocate meaning making as a process, like as an artistic process. Um, in terms of two things,
Like let me get
can
more
I can I
concrete.
can I say something briefly?
Sure.
I would say Kirsty as an artist basically has a kind of process of subverting common narratives to create the unique. And then myself as a psychologist has a more kind of universal unique, which is people are kind of creating uh, the unique, right? So yeah, meaning making. I think like the actual cause of like the responsibility of meaning making or creating the unique. I think I'm like prone to like ignoring that because the whole theory is like you can't help but to be unique. But then there's kind of like a subject of the unique, or Hegel would say will doubled onto itself, right? It's like you're already unique, but then what if I like doubled, like this is the Hegelian subject. I
Yeah,
double will
yeah. It's
onto
like the
itself.
second nature.
Yeah, well, like
You're right that
yeah.
we all are unique in a sense.
But if I consciously repeat it, now I'm in a different territory, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think making that you sort of have a given, you could say you have a given uniqueness, but to make that given uniqueness reflexive adds a different dimension to it. And let me just get more concrete with the meaning making as the sort of signs relating with signs is that for me, I don't have to think about meaning too much, more that my motion is I find meaningful if I'm in the flow of signifiers in a way that's not causing friction with my, let's say, silent drive. Like if that play of signifiers is flowing, then I find my existence to be always already meaningful. Like I don't need to then add another sort of meta dimension on it and say I'm doing something meaningful. Like it is meaningful.
Yeah, but also like for instance, there in terms of like to make psychology hyper, to make philosophy hyper, which is to like ultimately like if you have the cause of meaning making, unique meaning making, like this could be taken into the realm of art and philosophy, and we can consciously or intentionally kind of this is like hyperstate as well, which is to say like also it's like it's in stoicism, which is I'm aligning with the telos, like what is the purpose of what I'm doing? I'm doing this to make unique meaning of the thing, right? So this could even be creativity itself and so on. um but yeah, I think like this is a more obscure Hegelian point, which is will is the like subjectivity is doubled back on itself. So like if I consciously like understand that I'm doing something, it creates some different effect, right? And psychology does this all the time. It's constantly like bringing into consciousness the thing you're doing and changing, right? It's creating subjects of the self, really.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about, inspired by what you've been saying, is that you seem to be bringing in a lot of physics metaphors. The most
Am
common
I?
one's probably force. Well, the idea of force, for example, but also in your book, you talk about how self-interest also functions as a theory of gravity.
Right.
I just want to sort of say explicitly, like, how conscious is it or how important is it that these metaphors are being employed or used? And I just want to say, like, sort of in the context of my teaching of
But
Hegel.
it's not a metaphor.
Mhm.
It's an unsymbolized essence. It's exact and actual. It's unsymbolized real, I would call it.
So yeah, how do you understand the employment of these terms that are usually used in physics, like force, or even what's the connection between your ideas and a theory of gravity?
Right. So let's talk about dreams for a second. If you have a traumatic dream or if you have an anxiety dream, you might have a repetition of a real event, or anxiety is a repetition of an actual kind of thing. And then you have a kind of symbolized externality, which is like if you don't have a trauma dream, you might have lots of symbolization. One thing is standing for the next, right? Um, but even in trauma dreams, lots of things are exactly repeated. They're not symbolized. And then you have some symbolized content which can contextualize the trauma and anxiety, right? So let's go to force. I would say like arrogant enough to say like force is not a physics term, right? It's not simply a physics term, which is to say like uh, I suppose it is physics, but it's also something else insofar it's like it's rational force. So like for instance, uh, like we're talking with Zoom, there's like the force of connection and we can transport it. These are like actual forces. Like if I like to get boringly Kantian with it, it's like this is gonna go on YouTube and it carries the force of my understanding of philosophy, and then people hear it, and then that force kind of meets the force of their psyche, and it has a certain impact. Maybe they take one or two things that they kind of like, maybe they totally distort what I've said. So this is like the force of it. It's a little different than physics, because physics is like objects, like object force. How is this object going to hit this object? I could see why it's like you could say it's metaphysics, but I I would really challenge that it's not actual and concrete. It's not simply like a physics metaphor. Like it's insofar as language can talk about this sort of thing, it's language talking about uh, kind of the actual dynamics. And starting from like I would say an autistically categorizing place, which I'm not against, like factuality, like just categorizing factuality, how things are interacting with each other, like what is exactly happening. And I think this is like the Hegelian project, right? Which is what is happening. And it's also Descartes. Descartes says this about what philosophy is, meditations. Think about something boring, then think as many things as you can about it, right? That just is. This is kind of like the practice of philosophy. So like insofar the force is just the verb of things. Like what is the thing doing? What does it allow? Like how does it interact with other things? How is it contextualized with greater things? How is it universal in the Hegelian? Like how does this appear in other places, right? This is how I use force, right?
So it seems like the way you're using force is very close to the capacity for influence, even persuasion, the capacity for the movement of mind. Do any of these things sort of resonate with you as pointing in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, these are specific concepts: influence, persuasion, movement of mind. So like you have Edward, makes me think of Bernays using psychology to market, right? Or something like that. So it's like, let's say instead of Zizek in the clinic, what is mental health? And like, how do I produce mental health? I said instead, how do I fucking like get people to give me their money, right? Like, that's a different book. Like, okay, so Elliot, you understand force in the world, and maybe I'll think of this. Like, say if I'm PepsiCo, how do I actually get people to do a very specific action? But I'll say this is very like limited. And like for instance, like if you take it back to like what life consists of, like me buying PepsiCo products, like I would say it's like, okay, that is part of life, but it's like it's not like that deep. It's not that important, right? But like you could use it like this, like I'm gonna influence somebody to do a specific action. So I don't often think in terms of influence. Uh, but yeah, you could. It would be interesting to maybe develop these concepts more. And I'm sure like if you're really a psychologist, it's like, oh yeah, you're a fan of psychology and tell me 5 ways in which your theory can be exploited to sell people things. Right? That's like the real question of psychology. That's always the next question, right?
Well, I've seen that done quite often in various fields of psychology that they often translate into the ideology of market forces. And we commonly use that term. We commonly use the term market forces. So it's a concept that lends itself to many fields, not only physics,
Yeah,
but
so like collinear, like for instance, what I think of in terms of my knowledge of marketing and psychology, in terms of if you want to talk like a specific field of behavioral economics, which if you're in finance, you'll know what behavioral economics is, which is to say um, like how are people affected in order to purchase this or that thing? What how do people get negative associations with things that push them away from things or pull them towards things, right? Yeah, so this is like a whole science, and then there's lots of different models where you're trying to figure out what is the actual force and factor that's pushing someone towards something or away from something. So like if I was to be a marketer, like if I was to like really just like be like, fuck it, I want to make some money and be a marketer, like I would and try to do this psychologically instead of just like learning finance, which if you want to do, just learn finance or something. You don't need it. Behavioral economics is not a good direction, but like if I was going to try to like meld psychology, it would be like, how would I meld this? Is specific forces draw people towards things, right? Specific forces push people away from things. And behaviorally speaking, it's easier to push people away from things. Did you know that? Did we talk about this? So basically, we've never talked about this. Okay, good. It's a lot easier, and if you have a negative association for something, so for instance, if one day I just like pimp slap you, like you'd be like, what the fuck did you do that for? And I'd be like, because I'm a boss. I'm a boss ass motherfucker. Like this would be twice as impact. I would need to
that
do
makes sense. It makes
twice
sense.
as many positive things. Like or something. Like, but like that's
It's
a bad example.
the force of a negative event.
Yeah, say we had a negative interaction, which we never do because we're both like fucking enlightened as fuck
Chill. Yeah.
and chill as fuck, like whatever. Whatever. So we don't really have negative interactions, but if you started to be like, yo, Elliot, that wasn't so enlightened or that wasn't so chill, like that would actually have a greater impact than any of our positive interactions. So that's kind of fun fact about
I
influence.
think that's a super important thing to know. And at the same time, it's a slightly terrifying thing to know.
Well, it's one,
It's something
yeah,
everyone should at least have an understanding of.
yeah, but also if you're grounded in telos, you can ignore that. Right? Which is like if you're certain of your end, if you're certain of the meaning of something, like the vicissitudes are
It
can be
helps you traverse those
hidden.
vicissitudes.
Yeah, yeah. So like
Absolutely.
so this is kind of like the failing of behavior. Like ultimately, rationality is stronger, I would argue, than like the infinite evo psych ideas that you can kind of game rationality infinitely. I was like, I no, you can't. Like rationality is like, I would argue like rationality is the strongest recapturing force, right? Ultimately, rationality can recapture any force, contextualize it, push it. No other kind of force can kind of do that. So like, this is kind of like the mistake of like Evo Psych. Oh, they're women, they go out, they wear the red nails, and they're like ovulating. They're ovulating with the red nail, like Peterson or what. They literally say this kind of thing, like, and like, it's like, do you not think it's quite easy for like a woman going out to like be like to have something higher than this, like to like
Yeah,
be
it's
like, oh,
very
I'm trying to meet,
reductionist.
for instance, like I'm trying to meet someone, I'm not trying to meet someone. like rationality is greater, like has a greater power. And like that's why Homo sapien is the knowing, we're the knowing homos. We're homos that know, and that's epic. Um uh
I think it's a really good example because that's
yeah.
always sort of the spontaneous resistance I've always had to Evo Psych, and it's often the point of psychoanalysis that it really is about the practice of rationality, and it really is a faith in rationality because the whole principle of free association sort of it would be pointless if we were just reducible to the Evo Psych history.
Yeah. So like I would do argue that rationality, you could say like logos, the logic in things, like ultimately there's no like, this is why like hyperpsychology is a subject beyond itself. You cannot reduce life into any kind of partial things. Like ultimately you're talking about the subject of life. And I'm super suspicious that there's lots of parts of life that psychology can't talk about, like hard style techno, like hardcore techno. No one's talking about that. Like I like it. Why is that not part of psychology? And it's not part of psychology because it's part of life. But I mean, psychology should hypothetically encompass anything, right? But it doesn't because it's a specific ideology at the moment. So psychology is the process beyond the current ideology of psychology. And I would say it will be forever the ideology of psychology. Like it will take like uh enlightened sigmas, sigma, sigma men and women, and non-binaries to like ultimate
Non-binary sigmas, yeah, you gotta.
non-binary sigmas, which is to say like you could be man, woman, or non-binary, any type of
You got
sigma
you.
in the
But
future,
there's something.
because there will be an infinite contention between basic picking up of medical authority, psychological authority, common sense. So I'm saying all this stuff, right? So I think it's important to bring it back to reality. Chauvinistic application of ideology is like very powerful. Like it's super simple, happens immediately. That's why it all has to be translated into Californiaese, right? It all has to be translated into like administration. So this is like the great challenge, which is like, how do we? I think we've talked about kind of in philosophy portal, for instance, of like the Frenchman who talked about like, oh, pride, it's corporate, but we should have like tantra or whatever, these kind of things should be like kind of secret or whatever. I would say like there's
Are
an
you talking
inev
about Thomas Hamilrick?
yeah, that's
He's
the guy,
Danish.
the French. Oh, he's Danish, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Copenhagen enjoyers. You have a great football team, the only good one in Denmark. Anyway, um, uh, right. But I would say like it doesn't have to be secret. It will be because it's hard to it's hard to think well. Like there's lots of like kind of different vicissitudes of like medical authority. But is insofar as you have the most rational grasp of things, you'll always have the jump. You'll always have the jump on them, on those punks, right?
Well, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about in regards to specifically ego and its hyperstate is, and this ground of self-interest that seems to function throughout the thesis of the book is the way you talk about the formation of the singularity of fantasy. And that strikes me as an important thing to discuss, specifically when you're saying that there are a lot of things that psychology can't talk about.
Right.
And it seems like there's a lot of things that psychology can't talk about because it's sort of an abstract general notion of what we are, but it doesn't
But
seem to
also because
speak
it's not
to.
of psychology. Like you can't talk about Lil Baby in psychology. Lil Baby. Remember we were talking about Lil
Yeah,
Baby.
I see what you're pointing at. I think this is very important, but I think it's fundamentally wrapped up with the formation of the singularity of fantasy and how important that is. And I do think that that's something that is highlighted and foregrounded in psychoanalysis. But how does this appear and function in your work? And maybe then connected to that, how does this appear and function in your practice?
What is this? Sorry, can you
The
clarify
singularity
again?
of fantasy and how do we contend with the singularity of fantasy, which is seen as imaginary, but at the same time, we've already sort of established that the way you're thinking about the ego is trying to
Right.
make it more concrete. I
So I
mean,
think it's so
fantasy does have concrete effects.
fantasy. I'm a bit, despite my hat, like, oh, it's not focusing. It's I had a anyway. Oh, there it is. I am not responsible for the fantasy that other people project on me. Right. So I think a lot more about dreams,
That's great.
like concrete production of dreams. Let's go by my hat. My hat is, by the way, a Pleasures hat. Pleasures streetwear. It's from last year, but that's all right. I don't mind being kind of like a year out of date, out of season with streetwear because I just picked the best trip. So let's go by my let's start with that.
I
I
just
am
want to say
not
before you go, I mean, I think your drip is always 100%. You're
thanks.
always balling out of control.
Thanks, but this is an important question because let's go with the symbolic. And as Lacanian, symbolic means you can't just like invent. You have to start from a reference point. So Pleasures is a streetwear company, and they represent general geist of what fan. I am not responsible. So okay, for the fantasy that other people project on me. So this is like a good question. So which is to say, other people have ideas about me, or I become an object in other people's kind of like schemas or whatever, and they treat me like the object, and they as they self-reference and they move me towards the fantasy of whatever they see me as, which is their self-interest. It's their self-interest to confirm themselves, right? So I would say this is like the realm of the for this hat, for instance, it's the realm of the interpersonal, which is to say, like, if another person has a fantasy of what I am, that ultimately my fantasy of what they are, and will kind of have to come to a relationship of what do we create together. So for instance, like, I don't know your idea of me. Like, I have an idea of me, you have an idea of yourself, but we're different psyches. So like things like I like immeasurably, this is what mushrooms will tell you, immeasurably I have no idea how you're registering shit. Like, if I did, it would probably really fuck with me because, like, I don't know how you think. Like, your emotional vicissitudes, I probably would be very alien to me. I probably wouldn't like it, right? If you were me, you'd probably just be chill as fuck because I'm like we're both chill as fuck, but you're a little more like, yeah, I don't know, like concrete critique. You're like a good solid thinker, but I like it. Maybe there's an emotional. I have the sense that maybe there's an emotional vicissitude that might scare me. Just because out of factuality, and I don't know, but that's my fantasy. So you're not responsible for the fantasy, right? So let's go back to my hat. I'm projecting a fantasy on you, kiddo. It's a fantasy of skill. It's a fantasy of anxiety. Why is this outside of me? So you could say, like, what is the force of this? So hyperstate is like, I'm putting skill and anxiety outside of myself. So I don't need to have skill, and I don't need to have anxiety. I can be alive. I can be a living subject.
You outsource it.
So I project it on you so I can live. So this is actually quite demonic. Like, I'm sorry, Cadell. You can do similarly. You must also live. So
It is demonic. I mean, I don't know if I'm ultimately comfortable using the religious language, but I can see what the religious language is pointing towards. There
right,
is something demonic about that, and there is something very strange about social life that no matter what you do, engaging with the interpersonal, there's going to be this weird unconscious drama of
right,
phantasmatic projection. You can't escape it.
right. So nonetheless, we like speak and so on. But if we really get into the actual force, it's like that's quite wild. So like, where does my fantasy, insofar as its actual force, is where it falls. So like, I don't say I have anything that is mine. I'm trying to point to like what is. Like, I'm trying to say psychology, insofar as psychology is beyond the subject, it's beyond me, it's into the actual force of things, right? So I say hyperpsychology just to say psychology, right? So ultimately we're getting into this. So Cadell, like, this is where fantasy, that's fun. Fantasy can play a role, which is like, I think that's super interesting. Like, why do I put skill into you and anxiety? That's kind of like, And so like you have to think like Cadell, can I ask you, how do you relate to these signifiers I'm projecting onto you? Skill and anxiety. What comes up for
Uh,
you?
well, I'm not well, skill probably because doing what I'm doing does take a certain cumulative uh work effort over a lot of
Yeah,
time, which does involve a high degree of specialization, which
right.
is relatively improbable in regards to, say, normal action and behavior. Anxiety being projected onto me, do I give off anxiety? Do I give off anxiety? Maybe if I give off anxiety, it's because I also am committed to desire. Like I'm committed to the dialectic of drive and desire. And as a result of that, I am in regular contact with negative affect, negative emotion, and I am in regular contact with sort of being so close to the object of desire that I tremble.
Right. Proper philosopher. Awesome, man. Skill. It projects skill to
I
release
do I
release.
do
It's like
think
I can see that I'm releasing anxiety by doing this. Like it's sick. It's really sick. And
right.
efficient and very efficient. Like I feel great.
It's the talking cure.
It's the top, but it's like
The
so like
talking.
yeah, so like ultimately like then the question would be to go like since we're not in a therapy modality, it's like what is this interpersonal structure like? And this is like one of the
It's a
tendencies I wrote.
podcast. It's a podcast.
It's a podcast. It's a podcast, man. We're
But
just
though, but that is
it's too
that
deep
is
for a podcast, man.
it is related to
It's world fucking historical, man.
it is a world historical conversation, but it is also related to a question I wanted to ask you, very practical, because you are a practicing psychotherapist, which is that now going back to Zizek in the Clinic book, there is a part of that book where where you're juxtaposing sort of this hyper free association of someone sitting on a couch while the analyst is taking notes, and the person free associating is just looking at a wall, versus psychotherapy where you're face to face with someone, two people having more of a conversational
Right.
dynamic. What do you think are the trade-offs for people who might actually be interested in choosing going in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I think I'm great at psychoanalysis with myself. Like if I like sit on a couch, like I can say like, okay, I can juxtapose questions to myself and I free associate. Like psychoanalysis is like free association. Like you'll get different places with free association. You don't do free association if you're like staring at somebody. You're talking to somebody. It's a different style of speech. Um, it's more social, right? And I think life is so, insofar as life is social, I think this is like quite an advantage to psychotherapy, which is to say you're using your psyche in a social setting doing psychotherapy versus I think I think there are problems with solipsistic understanding uh, that I worry people's ability to talk themselves into a place that helps themselves. But maybe like insofar as psychoanalysis can do this, like great, right?
No, it's an important. I think it's a point worth discussing, which is that psychoanalysis does create a condition, kind of like a scientific experiment, which is kind of hyper artificial in the sense that you would never have that condition naturally occurring of its own. It's not like,
Well, you would when you think, you talk to yourself or think at yourself.
I mean, the specific dynamic with the analyst and the
Oh,
analyst,
right, right.
that doesn't really occur because a key part of psychoanalysis is also the analyst's intervention, right? Like the moment of cutting, the moment of identifying the right signifier, the signifier that, as it were, represents the symptom.
Someone wrote in a BetterHelp feedback that it was like talking to a wise friend. Something.
So it's psychotherapy is more like I'm getting that psychotherapy is more human, more ego affirming, and I've also had that conversation actually with someone who works at the NHS in psychotherapy, where she said to me, and I was talking to her about at the time I was running the Cree course,
Yeah.
and I was talking to her, I was telling her about what I was teaching in the Cree course, and her first response was something like, I don't know if I could use that modality with, for example, anxiety riddled teenagers. Like
It's
that
just too,
it
yeah,
might
it's just
not
too
be
like
the right
off.
approach.
It's just too not, yeah, like it's too avant-garde. It's too unlike anything that they do. Like you speak to account. Like
It's
I said,
alien.
so mental health, and this is like the very first point. Mental health exists in the world immediately, imminently, like it's always there, like ideologically. But you say do psychoanalysis. That's not in the world. Psychoanalysis is not in the world like mental health is. So it's worth thinking.
I like that.
I would say it's
I
worth
like the idea that psychoanalysis is very alien. I think science is very alien
science
in
is more in the
relationship.
it is, but it's more in the world than science. You can reference science. Elon Musk, and there are problems like Elon Musk references science, right? And it's like what's wrong? He's partial. He's too partial with his science references, right?
I guess what I mean by science being alien is that it creates sort of, especially if it's in like laboratory or field conditions, which are hyper artificial in their sort of experimental design, but also in terms of discoveries of the world that are fundamentally counterintuitive. Like, for example, the best example would be quantum
Right.
physics. You could also give evolutionary science because people wouldn't intuitively think that was the true.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is Hume's project. Like philosophically, like the limit of rationality is the scientific method, which will prove things that through data and through the scientific method that you would not be able to find by thinking at the thing, right? So, yeah, it's like science. Science is a process as well as a idea, but like you can kind of gain knowledge through empiricism, right? But there are limits to what empiricism can do. Like it can't necessarily contextualize or like I do believe in the power of rationality, kind of like I said of the Evo psych example. Well,
Yeah.
there's these many people and we did this study and we empirically kind of figured this out. You took a bunch of men. This is my favorite study. We took a bunch of men, we spun them around in the forest, took a bunch of women, spun them around, and how do you find your way back? All the men found their way back better than the women because men are transcendental navigators and women are object-oriented navigators. So this is like interesting, right? But like, but like ultimately, like I would say it ultimately has to go back into rationality, which is like, well, what do objects? So like science can figure out interesting being kind of properties of the body and self. Um, but ultimately, rationality then is like, what's the significance if this is true that women kind of navigate via objects and men navigate via transcendental maps, which they intuit, right? Yeah. So like ultimately, like science is good, but it's like being essence concept. So being the actual physicality of men and women, sex. Uh, Essence is this moment, and then concept, which is like transcendental understanding versus object oriented understanding or material understanding. And is there kind of a sex differential? And so now we can get into culture wars and all that if we want, but another time.
We can get into the culture wars, but I'm more concerned, even hyper concerned about
Hyper
the
concerned, yes.
I'm hyper concerned about the people 100 years from now who are
Yeah.
watching us after you're dead. I'll
Mhm.
still be alive,
You'll
but
be
you're
alive because you're
I'll,
friends with all the transhumanists. They're gonna give you
exactly.
the
So they're
they'll
gonna
give you
keep
the
me
juice.
around.
I'll be like, Cadell, the juice.
No, I got the juice. No, no, no.
Like, ooh, it's delicious.
I decide who gets the juice.
Blueberry flavored and dyed blue, so I get the dual effect. It's like,
But for those people in the hypothetical future, if you
yeah.
could say the principles of the Rosenstockian psychotherapeutic practice, what are we working with here? What are some of the principles that are unique to your work? expressed in your books, which people in the future should be aware of?
People in the future, go one fucking deeper, because like all these people are plebs and like this fucking just like, and we're better than them. And no, I mean we just spent like 2 hours talking about all the principles, but like what should people 100 years from now know? You should know, in terms of what's my current project about, you should know that psychology is not an end in itself, right? And people will like, or health is not an end in itself. You have to think life, right? And this is, read Marcus, I would say read Marcus Aurelius. He thinks life. At least it'll teach you how to think life, you know? And I think you'll probably have forgotten, because you got your stupid whatever 100 years from now TikTok is. You're probably in your metaverse or some stupid VR that's like super good, like PS5 style VR graphics, super good and stuff. Like, but you still have to, it doesn't like that, you cannot reduce away the problem of thinking life. Like the whole, like what the Stoics kind of understood, and what Hegel talked about as well, is like nature has, we're going to ignore the counter arguments for a second. Nature has no internal contradiction. Nature is moving things around. It's its own whole. Like the totality of things is its own like whole, and we're a kind of like partial force within it, moving things around and things like that. And ultimately we're concerned with life itself, this like existential question of life, how we should live it, what we want to do. I think self-interest is a good concept, because a lot of people will try to moralize at you in various ways. Look at like just Christianity as a religion, maybe Judaism as a religion, but like we're like kind of, you know, whatever. We're just better than everyone. We're chosen, so you can't even. Israel's happy 150th anniversary. 100 years from now, Israel, happy 175th. Yeah, going strong. You won all those wars, you didn't you? Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. Why couldn't they beat you? We won't go into that. That's so weird that they couldn't beat you. You know, it's like, and why is it when I take only half a course of antibiotics, and why are those ones so strong? I don't know. Unrelated. Anyway, yeah, good job, Israel, my people. Anyway,
I think it's an important point though that but I think it's a super important point, and maybe it is lost a little bit. Maybe it is lost a little bit on psychoanalysis, that you just have to think life itself.
yeah, I
And
should think life
certainly it's
itself.
lost, and I think it's certainly lost on the discipline of psychology, and maybe even our discourses of mental health. I love the point that psychology is not an end in itself. Health is not an end in itself.
Yes.
So when you think about life as such, life, the totality of life, what do you think the end of life is? Does that even make sense?
Yeah,
What
so
is the
yeah, well,
end
this
of
is
life
Heidegger.
entail?
So I think I don't like the stupid existential answer, which is the purpose, end of life is death, so the purpose of life is death. I think that's very stupid. Anyway, so let's go with this. Let's start with the Stoics for a second, which is the Stoics had ideas of telos. Telos is your environment. You have basic ends in your environment, meanings, or how to arrange your environment. You have telos, or meaning with other people. That's you and me, meaning, we're like doing things, yeah, and so on, other people. And then you have divine cause. This is what the people on Mount Olympus want you to do. And I would just change this to like, well, that's, you know, I know it's fun to like, you know, do all the, you know, demonology and so on, but like just cause in general, like bigger causes, greater causes, ideas, ideals, things for humanity, rituals towards humanity, right? So yeah, in terms of what is kind of like the purpose of life, is ultimately we're like, I would say, yeah, so this is the Stoic idea, but they have a kind of whole set of principles of what you should and shouldn't do to be a philosopher, and you don't do pleasures. And this hat is Pleasures brand. So that's a nice kind of deep cut. Von Deeper. You went 2 hours into this interview of Eliot and Cadell. Wow, you really give a fuck about philosophy. Good for you. Von Deeper. This is a pleasures hat, and the Stoics are against pleasures. That's your one deeper. because they like the joy that comes from philosophy. But I would say like that's like silly. Like ultimately like you have to be able to be able to think, you have to be able to think simple pleasures. You have to be able to engage directly unsymbolized with life, different options for you in life, in the world, and people and forces. And the man, the man and the government, man, they'll try to stop you from doing that, man. Well, no, but like everyone, and also being really fucking stupid. Like people will just like, they'll really think that like not doing that is like the right thing, but they're wrong. Trust me, I have a cool hat and a chain. That.
I think you've come across as exceptionally trustworthy in this interview.
How would I not?
Right.
Right. No.
So
No, but
ultimately, when we focus on life now, to me, there's a contradiction. When we think life, what I'm taking away from your message
yeah.
here, when we think life and when we think the end of life in itself, we come to an idea.
Yeah.
We come to an ideal.
Life is a higher ideal. Like for instance, the idea that I go to mental health works. I have the ultimate freedom. It's also like Hegel's idea of freedom. I have the freedom to self-determine, rationally self-determine my self-interest, how I engage with life. And there's lots of things that will pull you away from this, but also lots of things that will pull you, but like that you might even want to gather or pick up that do like restrict you but elevate you. So it's quite complicated. But yeah, maybe the last 2 hours would have helped people navigate it a bit,
Absolutely. Well, in terms of where people can find you, where to look for your work and future projects, maybe
Yeah,
just
follow me on
an overview.
Twitter. Follow me on Twitter, Hyperpsychology.
Hyperpsychology on Twitter, Zizek in the Clinic, presumably on Amazon. Links will be
Don't
in the description.
steal it. No, steal it. Steal it all. Buy Hyperpsychology when it comes out, but the rest you can. On my Twitter, you can download. Ego in its hyperstate, and also Zizek in its clinic in the clinic, because somebody posted under. I've been looking to buy it, but I can't because it's all sold out for redacted reasons. But it's all, you can't get these books anymore, so just pirate them. There you might find secondary places for them. So yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
hyperpsychology though.
Zizek in the Clinic, I mean, I think probably the first work to take Zizek's philosophy and apply it to clinical therapeutic settings. In terms of the ego and its hyperstate, we're dealing with another quite innovative model in regards to psychotherapy, something that is at the same time informed by psychoanalysis, at the same time deviating from and sort of in some sort of interesting relationship with the models of conventional psychoanalysis, specifically in regards to, I think, as you've emphasized throughout our talk, making the ego more concrete. And then hyperpsychology. Do you have any idea on a release date yet?
No, somebody asked me that. I was just like, end of 2024. I literally just pulled that out of my ass. I was just like, I'm still writing it. No,
Okay.
it's nowhere near complete. No. So I add to it. I have notes on my phone. I have notes written down. I have notes in Google Docs. Like,
It's a work in progress.
yeah. I mean, when you're thinking, like I said, like very concrete purpose of Zizek in the clinic. What is the mental health ideal, and how does it work in this two-person therapy format? How do you generate it in like a client? What is self-interest? What is the exposition of self-interest? What is psychology, and how is psychology beyond the subject of psychology? You have to talk about life. So it's like fucking hell. This is like the more total project. I literally probably could just title everything hyper psychology, and just like this will be the third infinite book until I'm dead in the fucking dirt, and just do hyper psychology. But maybe I'll
Which
get
is
bored with
not
it.
the point of life. Which is not the point of life.
It's not. It's just.
Although
It's
you've
just.
referenced it quite a bit now.
It happens,
It
but it's
happens.
like. But it's like. It's like it happens. It kind of feels bad that it happens. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Kind of
it,
sad.
it has some effects. We could talk about it. We could talk about that. But it's like there's. I would say, yeah, yeah, death, it happens. So it's fun to reference sometimes.
All
You
right.
know,
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Death, it happens.
death, it happens. Life,
Bell here
with
with
psychology
Eliot
as well.
Rosenstock.
But Freud says, the unconscious doesn't know death because we only have death as the concept of death. We don't actually
That's
experience
right.
ourselves dead, right? So
That's
like
right.
all our death concepts are we are the living dead insofar as like anytime you think of death or impacted by death, it's
Yeah,
really
that's literally where the living
it's
dead came
literally
from.
life. Like it's
Yeah,
literally life, not death, right?
absolutely.
So highest category, right?
All right. Well, for everyone who's been watching, like Elliot said, you must really love philosophy.
Yeah, you
Remember
made it.
Elliot's central message: I am not responsible for the fantasy that the other people project on me.
Well, this is
Think through.
Pleasure's message, to be fair, but I second it. Pleasure Streetwear.
Links will be in the description to Zizek in the clinic, as well as the ego and its hyperstate and whatever other online links I can scrounge up on Eliot Rosenstock. Elliot, it's been a pleasure as always. I encourage reading his texts, and this has been another philosophical conversation. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.